It's a conflict that's been around for 50 years. Colombia's FARC rebels have now captured a senior military official, but could this abduction mean the end of the long-running peace talks? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It is considered Latin America's longest conflict, Colombia's war against the armed rebel group FARC. President Juan Manuel Santos is trying what many leaders before him have failed to do, bring peace through negotiations. Representatives from both sides have been meeting in Cuba's capital, Havana. Santos has made reaching a peace deal one of his priorities, but not everyone supports sitting down with members of FARC. Santos's opponents accuse him of being too soft on the armed group. Now, the abduction of a military general may derail the talks and prove his critics right. The president says talks are off until General Ruben Alzate and two other people who were also captured are released. So could this be a game changer? What does this mean for Colombia's hopes for peace? To help answer these questions, I'm joined by Virginia Bouvier, Senior Program Officer for Latin America at the United States Institute of Peace. She's in Washington, D.C. In Bogota, Christian Vogel, Senior Analyst with the Colombia Andes Project at the International Crisis Group. And in London, Carlos Casero, Senior Principal Analyst for Latin America at IHS. Welcome to you all. Carlos, let me start off with you. What is going on right now? Could this derail the talks, derail the peace process?
Well, as things stand now, it is a serious setback because it's the first time that Army General is taken hostage by the FARC. That's true because over the last few hours, even the FARC are claiming that they are not responsible for taking hostage the general. And we are waiting for an announcement of the FARC today, 18th of November, to clarify this. Could it just be a horrible mistake? Well, the circumstances are extremely confusing. For example, and I think the FARC also mentioned this, is how it's possible that the second top general of the country in charge of 2,500 soldiers can go on a river boat without any protection, breaching all protocols of security. And secondly, the media has been reached this hamlet, and they said, the witnesses said that what they saw was the general and the other two persons coming next to the church, and three other persons came unarmed. They talked to each other and they went together. So there was no indication of confrontation or that they were forced to go with them. So what is going on here? That's why until this situation is not clarified, it's very difficult to make a clear judgment on this. Yeah, Christian Vogel really is a strange set of circumstances, but what sort of impact do you think his capture could have on the talks and the fact that Santos has called them off for now? What's the long-term impact, do you think?
Well, I think the long-term impact will necessarily pass through the short-term impact. And there, I think, is really the crucial, critical juncture. If the general is released within days, I think this entire episode could really pass down in history as a kind of minor hiccup of the process. But if for whatever reason the general is not found well, or his release is delayed by several weeks, shall we say, then of course the process could be theoretically in much deeper trouble.
Virginia Bouvier, is the country in the grip of a big crisis? Is this detrimental to what's going on there?
Certainly this is a bit of a crisis. But I think we shouldn't overplay it either. The parties before this incident, I think everyone agreed that the process was irreversible. That was the big buzzword. I think that there were certain conditions that both parties agreed to for these peace talks. One is that they would be negotiating in the midst of conflict, and the other was that the parties would stay at the table until they reached a final agreement to end the conflict. I don't think those have changed, and if they haven't changed, then this shouldn't lead to a prolonged interruption. I do think the longer that the issue is unresolved, the more likely it will have a long-term impact. However, if this can be resolved quickly, I think it also has the capacity to strengthen the peace process. Civil society is coming forward. They're calling for a major mobilization tomorrow in the streets to support the peace process and to encourage the parties to stay at the table. They're also calling for a bilateral ceasefire. This has been an issue that has been called for quite a while. The FARC from the beginning has called for a bilateral ceasefire. The government has said that they will not do a bilateral ceasefire. They'd like to see a unilateral ceasefire. The FARC has successfully had a unilateral ceasefire for short periods of time, joined by the ELN during elections this past year, and also had a successful ceasefire then.
Sorry, can I just quickly interrupt you and pick up on a point that you made, that all sides agreed that they would continue with these negotiations despite the fact that there is still a conflict ongoing. With that in mind, was he well advised, Santos, to stop these talks in order to find the military official?
Well, I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. And a suspension, a brief suspension, a brief interruption of the process while the negotiators get involved and try to figure out what happened is a tactic. And it's a fine tactic to the extent that you can do it quickly, find out information quickly, get that information into the public realm so that rumors don't continue to be generated. This, you know, the area of Chocó in Quibdó where the general was retained is full of all sorts of armed actors. The criminal bands operate there, drug traffickers operate there, the FARC operate there, the ELN, another insurgent group, operates there, and it's not clear who picked them up. Now, the FARC has a press conference this morning at 9 a.m. We'll find out more whether they actually accept responsibility or whether they say it wasn't them. The commanders in this zone are in Havana.
Let me bring Christian in here. This point raised by Carlos as well, that, I mean, here's a man who's extremely well trained, a military man, and he went in civilian clothing into a highly dangerous area. So obviously a lot of questions need to be answered there. There also seems to be, though, some sort of disconnect between the FARC, if it is indeed them, those on the ground, and those at the talks. Is that a correct analysis of some of the confusion here?
I think that could at least potentially be part of the explanation. What is happening is that because the talks are taking place in Havana and because FARC have now really relocated a substantial part of their command and control structure of the people high up towards Havana to really further those talks and to bring them to a successful conclusion. This means that potentially the command and control structure of FARC on the grounds is weaker than it used to be. Now, FARC are generally in pretty good shape, command and control-wise, contrary to what many people think. But here on the ground, we think they actually have control over a large majority of their troops. However, we have seen in the past that they've struggled to control their so-called militia networks, and this incident could just confirm that.
Carlos, I want to carry on with that theme of disconnect. There seems to also be some sort of disconnect happening within the military. I mean, I know from some of our people on the ground that there are those in the military who are against what Santos is doing. They tell us that they're revolted by what he's doing. Why is there so much anger?
Well, I think is the history of the Colombian conflict. There have been 4 failed attempts of a negotiation with the FARC, and all of them have failed. And the last one with the President Pastrana was actually taken advantage of by the FARC by strengthening his position. And remember this, the military zone, the size of Switzerland, was used by the FARC then to operate that as a liberated zone, and at the same time they were kidnapping people and taking people into that area. That created a very bad precedent, and that's why there is all this resistance to that. But to be frank, we are far away from what happened than more than 15 years ago. The situation on the ground politically, globally, internationally, and domestically have changed enormously. I think the FARC, IELN are anachronism, and there is no international support for them. They are weaker, and the military, the Colombian military is far stronger. So it makes sense that Colombia sits and finally settle for good this conflict. But at the same time, it cannot be that quickly because it's a 50-year conflict.
Yeah, let's
there
take
are many
a
things to
closer look
discuss
now.
and agree on.
Excuse me interrupting. At FARC, which is a Spanish acronym for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. It was formed in 1964 in part to fight for land reform. It is Colombia's largest left-wing rebel group. The UN says it has about 8,000 fighters and is one of the richest armed groups in the world, taking in more than $500 million a year just from illegal drug trade. The United States and the EU have listed it as a terrorist organization. Christian, give us a greater sense of what life has been like under FARC, the fact that they've had 50 years of conflict and those who've been caught up by them.
Well, I think the first thing really to say is that life under FARC is a very relative concept nowadays, because the FARC has lost over the last, say, decade or so, really substantial territorial control. So it is a reality of the Colombian conflict that there are no large swathes of land which are completely under FARC control. It's really a mixture of patches of land which have remained under social and military control of the FARC and areas into which the state has really expanded over the last decade. Now I think what is happening is that many of those really marginal communities are still under coca growers, for instance, or small peasants in areas which have been colonized over the last 50 years. In those areas, really, FARC continues to be a reality, and they regulate social life. They certainly regulate all the illegal markets from which they derive their incomes, so coca prices or the prices of exploiting illegal mining resources. So it remains a stark political and social reality, and not just a criminal reality in Colombia.
No, but that's an important point, isn't it, Virginia? I mean, how do you ever get rid of FARC, despite these negotiations, stalled as they may be, if there are such disparities in the country, if there's such poverty, such low levels of education?
I think a peace process, if it's to be successful and peace is to be sustained, has to deal with change. They have to look at the roots of the conflict, the poverty, the vast inequities between those who have and those who have not, the huge campesino or peasant population of Colombia that's been marginalized from political life, from social life, from economic well-being for so long. And something has to change. And I think when you have violence breaking out, some of that violence is actually a reaction to the fears of change, whether it's within the military or whether it's within the land-holding sectors, or whether it's regional bosses who have control in their territory, or people who are profiting from corruption during the war. There will be changes if the peace is to last, and I think we need to anticipate that. We need to anticipate that people will be scared of what those changes will bring for them personally. And we need to manage those spoilers, because those are the sectors that will end up being spoilers in a process.
Carlos, it's intriguing, isn't it, that 55% of Colombians support the peace process, but 53% are pessimistic. I mean, surely peace can only be a better alternative to what's been going on in the country.
Yeah, I think that's quite remarkable. But at the same time, it's quite also remarkable in the Colombian context that the former president of Colombia, one of the most influential politicians, is against the peace process, because it would be quite different if President Uribe accept that there is a need for this to be speeded up and support President Santos, but he has taken a different view on this, and he is promoting a military solution, and we know that the FARC will never be defeated on the ground, that eventually a negotiation has to take place, and I don't think President Santos has dropped the guard against the FARC. I think the military is still ready fighting the guerrillas, but there is a moment in which definitely this process needs to end, and possibly this is the moment. And And somehow that pessimism from President Uribe and his supporters, plus the fact that the FARC has a very checkered history in the 4 previous attempts to peace, is used by people against the peace to remind Colombians, look, this is going exactly to be the same, the FARC cannot be trusted. But honestly, I think the situation is very different now, and even the FARC is on the defensive, and they could try to save face by negotiating peace. If they don't do it, the conflict will extend for another 4 or 5 years, but in the end the FARC could fracture into different criminal gangs rather than a proper revolutionary army.
Yeah,
and
that's
this
a real
also
concern,
a not very good prospect for the FARC.
Well, Carlos, I'm going to pick up that point that you were making about the criticism levelled at Santos for the stance he's taking. The former Colombian president, Alvaro Uribe, has been one of Santos's biggest critics. Uribe, who is now a senator, believes that FARC should be defeated militarily, as he said. He tweeted that Santos has allowed FARC to feel like they are equal to the armed forces. That's why the terrorists kidnap and just call it detention. Christian, is it true here? I think what I'm reading behind this is that Santos has sold out. Do you agree with that? That he's been too soft?
I'm really not sure you could say Santos has been soft on the FARC. I mean, he has been the defense minister under which FARC really have received some of their heaviest blows. His presidency has been marked actually by rather a continuation of the military approach alongside this new political negotiation approach. So I'm not really sure you could say FARC has been soft on the FARC. What is happening is that indeed President Uribe and President Santos, they have a very different conception of what it means to talk to the FARC. Whereas President Uribe wants more or less a surrender of a undefeated guerrilla group, President Santos has indeed realized that a successful negotiation will pass through the acknowledgement of FARC's political character and through the necessity of a substantial social and democratic transformation. That really is the difference, and I think this is what drives at least part of this very heavy rhetoric and those bets.
What do you think drives FARC to the table, considering how much money they have in their possession? And as you know, if a country's poor and badly educated, that's obviously a real attraction.
Well, I think really what drives FARC to the negotiation table is the realization that they will not achieve their strategic goals, and that means in the case of FARC getting towards political power and exercising political power in Colombia, be it locally or be it nationally. They have realized they're not gonna get to this goal through the military way. So that really leaves for them, because I mean the balance of power is strikingly tilted towards the state. FARC have, you said, 8,000 fighters. The government security forces are nearly 500,000. So the balance of forces is so much tilted against them that they have realized the only way to realize their strategic goals is through a political negotiation.
Now, this is the 4th attempt to negotiate an end to the 50-year conflict. Land reform was one of the hurdles in the continuing talks. The two sides have now agreed to a process to reallocate land that was seized illegally during the conflict. In November last year, a deal was reached over political participation for former rebels in the future. It includes support for the creation of new political parties. In May, both sides said they would work together to fight drug production and trafficking. The illegal trade of drugs has provided FARC with much of its funding in the past, but some issues have not yet been resolved, including disarmament of the group and the repatriation of victims. Big issues to deal with, Virginia, obviously. But what do you make of the transfer of cases of military personnel that have been accused of human rights abuses, and there have been many under them, to military courts? How big a stumbling block is this to bringing peace to the country?
Well, I think this is one of the debates that's going on within Colombian society right now, and it's a huge debate. Human rights groups and international organizations are objecting and urging the government to reconsider and to be sure that military crimes are tried by civilian courts. I think the military-civilian balance of power in any transitioning environment is always a key variable. You generally do not want to see the military having too much control. You want to see a democratization of the process. You want to see a judicial branch that's functioning, that can prosecute people without fear of retaliation. Currently, the environment in Colombia is such that there are many death threats going on and being issued against social leaders in a variety of ways. And these, we don't know who's causing them. Many of the, what they call the BACRIM, the criminal bands, have claimed responsibility. They've sent out email threats en masse to people who have been supportive of the peace process. I think the question of how violations of human rights and international humanitarian law are dealt with is an issue that needs to be looked at in a comprehensive fashion. We need to look at the military, who, because they're representatives of the state, have a certain responsibility to protect and promote human rights that they bought into when they took up the role of defending the Constitution. So they, in some ways, need to be held to a slightly higher level of accountability. On the other hand, the insurgent groups as well need to accept responsibility. We've seen through this peace process a very gradual opening to accepting responsibility for wrongdoing. The state has accepted responsibility for acts of commission and omission. They did that following the release of the Historical Memory Center's report, Basta Ya, Memories of Dignity and War in Colombia, that accumulated a number of very, very troubling facts. You know, we know that 220,000 at a minimum people have been killed in this war, and we know that 80% or slightly more than 80% of those have been civilians. So there's a need for reparations. There's a need for truth-telling to find out what happened in these cases and why. There's a need for justice and for guarantees that this won't happen again.
And obviously,
truth-telling is a piece.
Excuse me, jumping in here. I mean, if you can deal with it, the benefits are enormous, Carlos, aren't they? Not only to Colombia, but for the region as a whole, and the US, who's a great benefactor to the military and the government.
Yeah, the benefit would be enormous. I think already the amount of foreign investment in Colombia has reached record levels, from 2 billion in 2002 to 15, 16 billion last year, and this year could be even higher. Even despite the fact that the conflict is still raging. So you can imagine all the benefit that could accrue to Colombia if the peace process succeed by the end of 2015. I think the possibility of increasing even more foreign direct investment will be there, but at the same time, tourism, manufacturing, mining, oil, so the possibilities are enormous, not to mention that the Colombian economy is relatively well run, and is doing very, very well. So
I'm going to quickly bring in Christian here for the last thought. And we've just been told the last couple of minutes or so that FARC rebels have just spoken out, and they say they're very committed to the peace process. They want to get these talks back on track. If that is to be the case, and there is peace in the future, what do you think, Christian, that peace in Colombia will look like?
Well, peace hopefully will bring social transformations in the regions most affected by the conflict, and those are regions in Colombia which really have been on the margins of the state, on the margins of public services, and on the margins of the economy for at least 50 years. So I think the biggest hope of peace will be that those territories which have been neglected over decades really will become the focal point of political policies. Now, that will bring short-term disturbances, because as Virginia already pointed out, there are people who stand to lose from that process. And these spoilers need indeed to be dealt with. Those are people which have accumulated enormous social and economic and political power in exactly those regions that will be the focal point of the post-conflict. And those people, unfortunately, they have an historical proclivity of using violence to defend their status quo. And this is certainly a threat that should be dealt with, and that needs to be dealt with over the short term, so that we can reap the benefits over the long term.
Okay, Christian Vogel, with those final words, thank you, and also to you, Virginia Bouvier and Carlos Caicedo. And we'd like to hear from our viewers, so please do send us your thoughts on this topic and other issues. You can also drop us a note at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or contact us on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story, mine at Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.